Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the greatest games on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. With me is Jonathan Wilson. And with us is Martin Da Cruz, an Australia-based PhD student, researcher and writer specialising in Uruguayan football history. He's contributed to the Blizzard and is currently working on his first book about the early years of the Uruguayan game. Martin, pleasure to have you on the pod.
Thank you so much for having me.
Today, we go back to the 1954 World Cup, the semi-final that ended Hungary 4, Uruguay 2. Martin, why have you chosen this game?
Okay, well, if I'm being honest, this game probably wasn't my first choice. Given my specialties, early Uruguayan football, I know this is early, but I'm talking really, really early Uruguayan football.
Yeah.
Probably would have felt a bit more comfortable with something like, I don't know, Southampton versus Uruguay from 1904, or maybe like an Argentina-Uruguay game from the same decade, something like that. Yeah. But to save your listeners, I guess, from an hour-long monologue, I went the extremely safe option. And this is, it's a very safe option, seeing that it's being dubbed the greatest game in World Cup history, and game of the century as well. And I think Jonathan as well has some knowledge about Uruguay's opponents. I think he wrote something as well about them.
I think that's fair to say, yeah.
I'm not sure. But anyway, so the game's hugely significant. So to quote Jonathan as well in his piece in the Blizzard, so the game pitted the best that had been against the best at the time. And that's pretty much it. So the game was hugely significant. Uruguay were the first global footballing power, beginning with their Olympic triumphs in the 1920s, and that dominance continued throughout the first half of the 20th century. So they were defending world champions after their coming off the 1950 Maracanazo triumph in Rio, and they were still undefeated in all World Cup or even World Championships, if you want to count the Olympic victories that Uruguayans do love to count and recognize. But anyway, so it pitted Uruguay and this kind of clash between the Danubian and Rio Platense schools of football. So these were two styles. Jonathan could talk about it a bit better. That developed in different parts of the world, but they're also still pretty similar as well. And also from the Uruguayan perspective, the game was very significant in that it really marked the end of their global dominance, and it really ushered in a period of decline on the international stage. And of course, the game itself was an absorbing contest, end-to-end, attacking, lots of drama and moments in Uruguay, at least, that have been transformed into legend. But yeah,
I mean, I think that's sort of a key point, that a lot of the games we do on this podcast are not great. You know, the game itself is not that exciting and not that high quality a game, but it has a significance. This is a game that has immense significance, and also, what you find when you look back through world soccer or whatever, and you see people being asked, "What's the greatest game you've ever seen? What's the greatest game in World Cup history?" And from 1982 onwards, people tend to say Italy 3, Brazil 2 from 1982. Before 1982, everybody says this game, and it is, in as far as you can tell from the very, very complicated highlights which are on YouTube, a lot happened. We can certainly say that. Quite what order it happened in and who was doing what and when is a lot harder to say, but you can see that this was a game of enormous incident, as well as having this profound significance.
I mean, I'm just have to jump in for the sake of our listeners, because some people will say, well, hang on, the game of the century was, of course, Italy versus West Germany at the Azteca at the World Cup. But a lot of journalists do think actually this was the great.
Yeah, okay. I don't think. I think that 1970 game is massively overrated. It's a really exciting period of extra time, because both.
It has a
both
plaque,
sides
Jonathan. I've seen it.
I mean, if I owned a stadium and I had a World Cup semi-final that finished 4-3, I would probably also put a plaque up to it. But I think if you actually watch it, it's just two teams who are exhausted and can't actually play in extra time. So sure, that game was really exciting, but this game I think is much higher quality, and I think the ramifications of it were much greater, because the greatest team in the 1970 World Cup was neither West Germany nor Italy, whereas although Hungary didn't win this World Cup, I think they were the the greatest team in it.
Yeah. And Martin, I should say that I'm sure, when you said that you wanted to go for a much older game, and this is obviously much more recent, I'm sure younger listeners will be appreciative of you bringing a modern game to the conversation from the 1954 World Cup. But then, the 1954 World Cup, just in general, was incredible. Obviously, we're looking at this from sort of the Uruguayan perspective in particular, a little bit from the Hungarian one as well. But Martin, the 54 World Cup, some absolutely incredible scorelines and some incredible moments and some incredible history there. Just seeing how both sides got on in their groups. Uruguay topped their group, beat Czechoslovakia 2-0, Scotland 7-0, but Hungary had defeated South Korea 9-0, and obviously, famously or infamously, depending on how you look at it, West Germany 8-3 in the group. A lot of goals in this tournament.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that the structure of the World Cup is slightly odd. So each group had 2 seeded teams, 2 unseeded teams. And so the seeded teams would play the 2 unseeded teams, but not the other seeded side. The other team in that Hungary group, you mentioned games against South Korea, against West Germany. There's also Turkey in that group, who bizarrely was seeded ahead of West Germany. So although it's 4-team groups, the teams are they're only playing 2 games each. But if they finish level on points, rather than going on goal difference, they then have a playoff. So it's a very strange structure. I think that's probably one of the reasons why it is so high scoring, that certainly in the early stages you got a lot of mismatches. But you also had, for instance, that the Switzerland-Austria game finished 7-5, which I think is still the highest scoring game in World Cup history. And that appears to have been a result of extreme heat. The tournament's in Switzerland. And both sides seem to struggle really badly with the heat in the second half of that game. So I think what you're beginning to see is an attempt to play a more modern style of football, a more energetic form of football, but with bodies that are still not quite used to that. But sports science hasn't quite caught up to the tactics. And I think the big changes you see in the 60s are a result of sports science catching up with what people are trying to do tactically. And so I think that's another reason why you suddenly get teams collapse. But also, this is when football is still a very, very attacking sport. The idea is just to score more than the opposition. The idea of sort of sitting back and defending is still fairly alien to teams.
Yeah, that absolutely. When you say that the teams were knackered, therefore there were more goals. In the modern era, the teams were knackered, therefore there were no goals, or much fewer goals, of course, would probably tend to be the case. But Martin, Uruguay, going into the tournament, they had won the 1950 World Cup, which is, of course, one of the great sort of David and Goliath stories as well. They must have been very confident going into this one.
Yeah, Uruguay were confident going in. The team was arguably, in my opinion, it was stronger than the 1950 team. So they had already lost. They were without Alcides Guija, who was the hero of the Maracanazo, the right winger, who scored the winning goal against Brazil. He had moved to Italy a couple of years before that, but they had replaced. They had really bolstered their attack with some players like Abadi, Ambroise, Borges, a winger. But they still maintained that base of that 1950 side. So the 2 main men were Juan Alberto Schiaffino, who was Uruguay's, you would say, is their main man. He was the brains of the team, a real elegant inside left playmaker, excellent dribbler, just brilliant vision, intelligence, and all the attacking, or most of Uruguay's attacks we'll see in this game against Hungary roll through him. They also had their captain Obdulio Varela, who was still there, so that mythical kind of figure, the leader of the team. He was 37 years old going into this tournament, so he had lost most of his pace, but he's still that larger-than-life figure, and he was still critically important to Uruguay's their team structure from his position at centre-half, which is traditionally a very important part of Uruguay's style of play. And they also had players like right-back Victor Rodriguez Andrade, who was the nephew of the famous Jose Leandro Andrade, who was the first black international superstar who played for Uruguay in the 1920s in the Paris Olympic Games, and then the other victories. But yeah, going in, there were mixed results. Uruguay after that 1950 win, they didn't play a game until 1952. So it was about 20 months without a game compared to Hungary. I'm not sure how many games they'd played between 50 and 52, but
the World Cup final was the 36th game since 1950.
There you go.
So and they would play. They were deliberately playing a lot because they were good, and so for the communist government, there was huge propaganda returns in playing this brilliant football and annihilating everybody. I wanted to ask you though, Martin, about the coach, about Juan Lopez, who'd been the coach in 1950. My impression is he was sort of a figurehead. He wasn't really sort of a real sort of tactical mastermind. But he'd become coach of Peñarol in 52. So was that
Correct.
disruptive, the fact that he was coaching one of the two big sides in Uruguay? Because I know that had been an issue with him at Herschel in the build-up to 1950.
Yeah, well, it was. Yeah, Juan Lopez was. Yeah, he was when he moved to Peñarol in 52. There were issues with kind of selection controversies for Uruguay. So I think it was in the 53 game against England that I can talk about a bit. He didn't play a couple of players from Peñarol, and there was pressure to play players from them. And when he played someone from Nacional, their rivals, there were some issues there. But I think throughout most of his Uruguay managerial career, he was managing teams at the same time. But he wasn't this master kind of tactician. Like, he was someone that would say that, one of his main kind of phrases that there are no secrets in football. So Uruguay kind of, really always held on to tradition, their style of play. So they didn't need this kind of master tactician. And he also wasn't a disciplinarian as well. He had a real close relationship to players, and he really sought the advice of everyone around him. So this is something that he would run into trouble over later in the tournament in the lead up to this game that I can go into. But yeah, Juan Lopez was an interesting figure.
Yeah, I mean, Martin, you mentioned the kind of the style of play and tactics and whatnot. Obviously, in the modern day, one can think of Uruguay having very stern, solid central midfield players, bit of quality up top. How was the sort of the stereotype or the style of play back then? Was it quite similar or quite dissimilar?
I mean, when you're looking at the Rio Platense style, Jonathan could explain it a bit more. But Uruguay's game was still based upon combination, short passing style of play, and they still did rely on kind of creative attacking players as well. So it still had this dribbling kind of style from the wingers as well, but they still did maintain a kind of defensive base. So if you want to compare them to Argentina, Uruguay did seem a bit more, sure if it was pragmatic, I guess, and they really did adapt to situations. They always thought about. They weren't too kind of proud to not change up their style. They were able to adapt to opposition as well, but they were still hard teams. Really, you can see that they didn't play. They try to play with style and with kind of elegance, but at times they did kind of get a bit physical. They weren't scared of that.
Well, South American teams tend not to be, bless them. But no. Jonathan, Uruguay, I mean, geographically where they are, it was an interesting place. They're sort of, if you will, sort of in between Argentina and Brazil, two of international football's heavyweights. And obviously they'd sort of, they'd beaten Brazil in the 1950, sort of unofficial final, if you like, the final match of the tournament. It's quite remarkable where they sit, considering they have these two massive neighbours in terms of population, geographical sort of landmass, but also their place in the game as well.
Yeah, well, that's what actually made them so good, and that's what made them reach the top of South American football. So football was introduced into Uruguay, and it was closely entwined from the very start. It was always closely entwined with the national story. And that kind of national story from at least the late 19th century, or even from independence, was Uruguay, this very small country wedged between the two giants, overlooking them, Brazil and Argentina. Up until the first decade of the 20th century, Uruguay's borders weren't even complete. They didn't have any treaties with Argentina or Brazil. So they're always kind of in the imaginary and also in reality, they were under threat from their neighbors. So football was a way that Uruguay could really match their countries, the neighbors that were geographically larger in size, that had military strength and economic strength. So that was reflected in football as well. The way that Uruguay played was based on intelligence and teamwork and beating the opposition as well, no matter how they could do it.
And then that's tied into this idea of Gara, isn't it? Like La Gara Charrua. So, I mean, do you want to explain a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so the Gara Charrua is something that's developed a little bit later on. So, I mean, Uruguay didn't really have an idea of Gara Charrua as a concept, an idea until the 1930s. So before then, Uruguay played football and they just wanted to play good football. It was based on combinations. It wasn't based on solely just a determination. And that this is what the Gara Charrua is. I didn't explain that. So this kind of like street smarts, this kind of determination, winning at all costs, or like, kind of in the face of adversity, kind of overcoming and winning. But Uruguay, that didn't really develop until after their first World Cup win in 1930. So that was an idea that developed in line with Uruguay's decline as a power. This started around 1930 when their players were getting older, things weren't looking that good, and then they won in the 1935 Copa America in Peru. With they had players like Nasazzi, who was getting on. He was in his late 30s at the time, and other players as well. They were aging, and they beat Argentina in the final. And that was the moment when this kind of idea of Garra came in. So it wasn't so much the actual determination, this kind of innate characteristic of Uruguay, but it was more this kind of like, this is my opinion as well, but this is more of a kind of desperation to kind of go back to that successful past. So this is something that didn't get Uruguay to the top in the first few decades, but from 1950 and 1954, we'll see here where the idea of Garra really comes out as one of the main characteristics of the Uruguayan game.
Okay then, chaps. Well, let's have a quick break and then we'll talk about the match itself. See you in a moment, everybody. Welcome back to the greatest games on the Blizzard. Right, gentlemen. So we talked a lot about the Uruguayans. I think it's fair, Jonathan, to maybe mention the Hungarians. We talk about goals in the tournament. I mean, Sándor Kocsis got a fair few. He got 11 in total, which is quite remarkable. Because even I think the next goal scorer down was it sort of 6 goals or 4 goals, something like that. So he was well away the tournament's top goal scorer. But I mean, some of the names heard long ago, Jonathan, if you will, Nanda Hidiguti, Tibor, Puskás, what a team they had.
Oh, I mean, an amazing side. It's the, I mean, obviously people didn't realise this at the time, but it's the final flowering of this sort of golden 3.5 decades of Hungarian football. So Hungary had been in the World Cup final in 1938. They'd had this incredibly vibrant and rich culture, which, because of the political and economic turmoil in Central Europe, with the decline of the Habsburg Empire in the end of the First World War in the 1920s, there's this enormous diaspora. And so the book you very kindly mentioned, The Names Heard Long Ago, is really about that diaspora, and it's about how Hungarians go everywhere where people are good at football. There's been a Hungarian influence. So I think you can make the case that other than Uruguay in 1930, every team that's won the World Cup has done so in some part because of Hungarian influence. So even in 1950, So Imre Herschel, who'd essentially been exiled from Argentina because of match fixing, he winds up in Uruguay, and he becomes coach of Peñarol. And he'd been appointed national coach before 1950, but it had been vetoed because of his links to one of the two major clubs. It was, that was seen as being too divisive. But his influence over Varela was clearly significant, and the suggestions that the way Uruguay played against Brazil in that last game was in part influenced by Herschel's ideas, as sort of transmitted through Varela. But enormous influence over Brazil, over Argentina, over France, over Scandinavia, over Italy. I mean, 60 coaches in Serie A before the end of the Second World War were Hungarian. Germany, Austria, former Yugoslavia, and even England through the two victories in 53 and 54 when they won 6-3 at Wembley and then 7-1 in Budapest. And this great culture begins to be attacked by the right-wing governments of the late 30s, because a lot of the best players, a lot of the best coaches, a lot of the best thinkers about football were Jewish, and so MTK, which was perceived as being the Jewish club, was run down and was effectively forced to close at the beginning of the Second World War, when Hungary allies to Nazi Germany and adopts the Nuremberg laws. It starts up again after the Second World War, but you then get the communist government takes over in 1947. It decides to nationalise football in 1949. And in the short term, this is very beneficial, certainly for the national team, that the majority of the best players are collected together at Honved, which was the army club, so they could conscript players. And MZK becomes Volkslebugo, which means Red Banner, as a team of the secret police. And they're sort of the second team. So people like Hidecuti played for Volkslebugo for MTK, but Puskás and Bostik were at Honved. And so because they're playing together all the time, they understand each other's games. The unit becomes very slick. There's this great mutual understanding.
Which was a club side, really.
Yeah, it was a club. Yeah, it was. I mean,
yeah.
It's like a very. I mean, essentially, they looked at Italy in the 1930s and how the bulk of their squad had come from Juventus. And I guess a more modern examples would be how many of the Germany team from 2014 played for Bayern, or the Spain team of 2010 played for Barcelona. But they'd done that artificially, just get them all at the army club, get them all at Honved. And Ferencváros, which had been the other great power along with MTK in the 20s and 30s, they were seen as being the German club, and they were seen as being very nationalistic and had right-wing elements. And so they were deliberately run down. And so these two great schools of football, MTK and Ferencváros, have both, one by the right wing, one by the left wing, have both been deliberately, the roots have been cut out. And so once you get to the end of this generation, and that is accelerated by the uprising in 1956, which leads to a number of key players, so Puskás most obviously, but also Szybor, also Koksich, they all defected, and the entire under 21 squad, which was in Geneva at the time of the uprising, they all go en masse. And there's nothing there to replace them. The culture that produced those players and that knowledge had been destroyed. So this 1954 is really the last flowering of the Great Hungary. And it was a really great Hungary. They'd won the Olympics in 52, and they'd gone unbeaten in those 30-odd games since 1950.
Mm-hmm. Uruguay, of course, was say defending world champions, and they'd never lost a World Cup match. Hungary unbeaten after they'd returned to international football. Hungary were the favourites, though. I mean, Luis Tricolli, the head of the Uruguayan delegation, said ahead of the match, "I believe this game is going to be the real final of the tournament. 4 years ago, we were the underdogs against Brazil, and as far as I can tell, the Hungarian team is even better. Nevertheless, we succeeded in 1950, and I believe we can repeat that." Of course, West Germany would go on to win the tournament, but in saying that they're the underdogs, but yet they were sort of quietly confident, it showed you what both parties, especially the Uruguayans, thought of this game, Martin, that there was a feeling that these were the best two sides in the tournament, and as they were saying, it's the unofficial final.
Yeah, that's definitely the case, and I've got a few contemporary sources from Uruguay at the time that pretty much relayed that exact sentiment. A lot of it kind of set up more of a kind of back to the wall type mentality for Uruguay as well. A lot of them were talking about the European media was talking up Hungary, and they were the favourites against Uruguay. So a lot of it was like, yeah, we can go in there and show them, what we can do, and that we're not just, we're not, we shouldn't be written off anytime soon. But that was the idea, going into the game, pretty much, that it was a final.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the sort of the European press there. We know in, say, 1962, when the Italian journalists offended Chile and the big riff happened there, and wondering whether that kind of really put more of a rift, more of a split between this European and South American sort of traditions and ideas. Was there a huge split, or were the Europeans seen as snobs towards the South Americans at this point in football? Had that always been there?
For Uruguay, not really. That wasn't really the case. I mean, they were a bit disgruntled at the journalists for this kind of pro-European bias, but there was no real kind of anti-European sentiment in Uruguay. I can't talk for the other South American nations like Argentina, for example, who kind of had this heavy oppositional identity.
But I mean, we'd seen the real flashpoint between Brazil and Hungary in the quarterfinal.
Yes.
The Battle of Bern. This incredibly violent game with 3 sendings off, I think, in the end. That mass brawls, allegations of racial abuse by the Hungarians towards the Brazilians, bottles being thrown in the tunnel afterwards. And Puskás had been injured in the group game against West Germany. Had suffered a stress fracture of the ankle, and so missed both the quarter and the semi-final. But he got involved, apparently throwing a soda siphon. So that game had been, there'd been enormous tension there. And I think what's notable about this game is sort of the sense of relief afterwards, that it passed off without violent incident. I mean, it's very fiercely contested, but you see both sides sort of talk about the other team as gentlemen, that this was just a great game of football.
But there was a concerted effort before the game, Jonathan, you'd say.
Yeah, absolutely.
To make sure that there wasn't a repeat of the Battle of Bern between Hungary and Brazil. Yeah,
I mean, because those scenes had been a great embarrassment for football. Clearly it would get worse Chile in 1962, I guess, is the worst example of that. But I think there was a sort of growing sense that, or a fear that was planted with that quarterfinal, that if this is how football is going to be, this doesn't really work.
Yeah, but the coach though, Gustav Seves, said he gathered his players, didn't he, before the game, and the game plan was to keep position but keep moving the ball quickly and not sort of dilly-dally on the ball and try any tricks, because the Uruguayans love to get stuck into the tackle. So,
I have to say, I'm really sceptical that Seves ever said that. Seves was...
Well, he may not have used the Hungarian equivalent of dilly-dally. But
no, Seves was a brilliant politician.
Okay.
He was a great manager in the sense of getting stuff organised, making sure his team had the right equipment, making sure training happened on time, getting the right staff in place. He had zero tactical knowledge. Everybody who played for him, everybody who worked with him, says that he knew that. He knew he was an administrator. He wasn't a coach. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things with Hungary in this period is the constant sort of throughput of coaches. As he keeps on picking coaches who turn out to be politically unacceptable to the communist government. He was very good at sort of managing upwards. So Martin Da Cruz, who was the coach of MTK or Voslebogo at the time, I think is probably the greatest coach who's ever existed in terms of a tactical intuition and understanding. But he could never have been national coach, because he just couldn't get on with people. And he becomes, after the uprising, just before the uprising, after Seves loses his job in 1956, Bukovi gets the job as part of a 3-man committee, and it rapidly becomes apparent that this just isn't going to work, because he can't handle the personal relationships of having to deal with the communist authorities. So somebody in the Hungarian setup, I'm sure, said that, I'd be very surprised if Shebe said it, or if he did say it, somebody had written it down and given it to him to say.
Well, fair enough. I mean,
But with the
yeah.
Sorry, yeah. So with the Battle of Bern, that also had the violence of that Hungary-Brazil game had a big influence on Uruguay's style of play as well, or their attitudes going into the game. And that was looked at in different ways. So first, they were conscious of the risks of any send-offs. So this was late in the tournament. Uruguay had already suffered a few injuries and fitness issues going into the game. So they were, and knowing that they were facing a strong side, they kind of made sure, or journalists were making sure that they weren't getting into any fights or any kind of rough goals like that to risk going a man down. And they also, back to the issue of South America versus Europe, there's also a feeling that Uruguay kind of had to save the reputation of South American football as well after that contest. I mean, this is not to put the sole blame on Brazil for that game against Hungary, their actions. But Uruguay's style has always been based, while it's always been based on opposition to their neighbors in Brazil and Argentina, they've always had a strong kind of regional identity and the sense that they were leaders of South American football, had a really strong kind of internationalism, a sporting internationalism in their game. So Montevideo's newspapers as well, they kind of brought out this, they hit out against European bias, but they did it through FIFA, by attacking FIFA for not suspending any of the Hungarian players for the semi-final.
That's an extraordinary point that Bostic was sent off, but was not suspended.
Yeah. So Uruguay's press was really angry at that for not sending anyone off for that, and they claimed that this global authority, their lack of action was showing a clear European bias. And they said the same thing, I know, it was because Brazil wasn't playing in the next game, but they said, let's see, what happens when South American teams do this. Let's see what happens if they make the next round. So that kind of really...
Well, we did see 8 years later that Garrincha got sent off in the semi-final in '62 and still played in the final. So yeah. This idea of suspending players being sent off seems not to have been as obvious as it would appear to us.
Well, there was some key players missing for the semi-final, though, between Hungary and Uruguay. Puskás, of course, got an injury against Brazil, but Uruguay were without Oscar Miguez and Abadi, Martin, which were two big players for them and two big losses.
Well, and Varela as well.
Yep, yeah, yes. Too big. And I was going to mention, Obdulio was probably the most influential loss. So he got injured in Uruguay's quarterfinal game against England, that they won 4-2. And Obdulio actually injured himself after scoring to put Uruguay up 2-1 in the first half. He scored from outside the area and he ran in, and you can see it in the footage, him leaping up in celebration near the penalty spot. And then when he came down, he had actually injured his hamstring, and that forced him off the pitch for the rest of the game. But it didn't physically force him off the pitch for that game. So he remained on the pitch on the Uruguay's left wing. So Juan Alberto Chafino was moved into his position at centre half, and Obdulio was pretty much just sitting on the sideline and just pretty much coaching the side for that game. So going into this game, you had Obdulio, Abadi, and Miguez who were out. So Abadi was replaced by a right winger from Nacional called Souto. And regarding Obdulio's place, there were even suggestions that Juan Chafino would be switched from inside left to a centre half position. He'd been known to, he had that much quality that he could play anywhere on the park. And I think later on in Italy, in his career in Italy, he even ended up playing as a sweeper at some point. But the biggest controversy leading into the game was the shock exclusion of Miguez, Uruguay's centre forward, who up to that point and to this day is still Uruguay's top scorer, all-time top scorer in the World Cup. So he was seen as a guaranteed starter. To the day of the game, he was announced in the Uruguayan press in the lineup. But word had it that there were two officials in the Uruguayan delegation who were becoming fed up with Miguez and his attitude. So Miguez was he was kind of the archetypal Rio Platense style footballer, in that he's like a cara sucia that Jonathan wrote about in his Argentina book. So he had a real game of the of street football where he was kind of really creative. He was known to just do rebonas, nutmegs, and just toy with the opposition. And he had that kind of freedom and innocence that didn't really fit in with Uruguay's kind of overarching mentality that football was about winning. This is about being serious. So he was a bit of an anomaly, and that kind of style of play was shown the year before when Uruguay played England at the Centenario. So that was the first game between the two countries in 1953, and Uruguay ended up winning that 2-1. Absolutely dominated England, and by the end of it, Uruguay were pretty much just they were taking the piss out of England, I must say. Miguez in particular, people were saying that Uruguay could have racked up a margin as wide as the Hungarians did later in that year if it wasn't for Miguez and other players just resorting to tricks. There was one moment towards the end of that game that Miguez, he did 2 consecutive sombreros. So he flicked the ball over England's captain Billy Wright twice at the end of the game. So this is the type of player that you had. And going into the last game, some officials were fed up with his kind of lackadaisical approach to the game. He seemed a bit overconfident after they beat England, and even in a practice game against the Swiss side, he had resorted to his little back heels, his tricks as well. There was also a graver rumor as well to do with Miguez and one of the members of the delegation's wives as well, that he had an affair as well. I'm not sure if that was ever confirmed, but his exclusion here was a mystery. But up until the day of the game, Juan Lopez had him in the lineup. He resisted any moves, but astonishingly, Miguez's inclusion was actually put up to a vote, and that included members of Uruguay's delegation, so officials as well. They voted, and they overruled the coach's decision, and Miguez was excluded from the team.
And so it's Hoberg. Hoberg comes in instead. Is that?
So Hoberg comes in instead. So Hoberg was a naturalized Argentine. So he was born in Cordoba, and he had moved to Peñarol, that famous 1949 Máquina machine side of Herschel. So he replaced him at inside left. So for this game, they had Schiaffino moved from his regular position at inside left into centre forward to play a more withdrawn forward game. So this Miguez exclusion really shook up Uruguay's attacking structure, and that's what came out, and that was evident during the game against Hungary.
Yeah. So let's talk about the match itself, gentlemen. It's a great game, and as we say, there was a little bit of an open display to show that this is a more gentlemanly affair. This is not going to be another battle as there was in Bern against Hungary and Brazil, of course. And it didn't have to wait too long for the first goal, Jonathan. 13 minutes in, and Hungary went 1 goal up. Yeah,
I mean, we should say that there's two compilations of highlights of this game on YouTube. Yes. They're both deeply weird. So don't go into this thinking you're going to find something normal. So the shorter one seems to be an outtake from a longer story about a child trying to get to a game. And so it starts with him leaning through a car window, listening to a radio, and then trying to get a lift, and the lift going in the wrong direction. But there are highlights in and around that.
I'd recommend that one.
With a BBC RP voiceover, which bears very little relation to anything going on. The other one is much longer, and it's one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. It's like football highlights edited by David Lynch. There's this clock with a Canada Dry ginger ale advert on it. And it's obviously a clock designed specially for football. So one hand shows the minutes and one hand shows the seconds. But it took me a long time to work that out. There just seem to be like random times, sort of like 20 past 12, 6:45. But it turns out this is actually sort of 7 minutes and 45 seconds or whatever. And it's it's footage from 4 cameras sort of spliced together. Some of it has this very jaunty theme music and the German commentary. Some of it's dead silent. It's very, very hard to work out what's going on. But what we do know is that in the 13th minute, Hidakuti, in that classic deep lying role, chips the ball to Coxfish, who's famously golden haired, brilliant in the air, and he heads it down for Shibor, who scores with his low shot, which Maspuli's
keeper
maybe could do better. He's a little bit flat footed. But this is what Hungary do though. Hungary were one of the first teams to take warm up seriously, and a feature of their play in the early 50s is they would surge into a lead. They regularly were 1 or 2-0 up after sort of 10-15 minutes, and so it was again.
Yeah, well, the second goal came just after half time, and it was Hidaguti, who was one of the great stars of that Hungarian side, and at 2-0 up. They're going to be feeling confident. They thought, we'll go on and we'll be okay. But the man that you mentioned, Martin, who came into the side, Juan Hoberg, pulled one back for Uruguay in 75 minutes, I suppose justifying his inclusion because it was very controversial, as you mentioned, that he was left out the side. Magyars was left out the side, sorry.
Yeah. So Uruguay, as I said, Schiaffino's the switch, the change of the attacking lineup or structure really affected Uruguay's play in the first half. It appears it was all disconnected as well, at least compared to the Hungarians' highly organised play. So Uruguay, they still had Schiaffino as their main attacking outlet, so he was all over the pitch, the outlet for every attack, and only to that point. Ambroise was the only one who was really supporting him in any way. So in the 75th minute, around there, Uruguay got one back. And that was actually from, it began in the middle of the pitch. It was Ambroise that received the ball, I believe, and he moved forward and he put Holberg through on goal, and he slid the ball past the Hungarian goalkeeper quite nicely. And that brought them back into the game, and that caused a frenzy of chances, I think, after getting that one back. And this was, so I think in the second half as well, I mean, it was raining all day before the game, and that had affected. Yeah, they weren't great. And I think it was a light rain during the first half, but I think it started raining heavily, or started bucketing down maybe towards the end of the first half, and that might have affected.
Well, that's one of the other weird things about the highlights is there's loads of cutaways to the crowd of people wearing bizarre things on their heads, which just makes so there's a man with a wicker basket on his head. There's a child with this sort of like a witch's hat made of cardboard on his head. So like the whole thing is utterly bizarre. But yeah, presumably that's just because it was raining heavily and there was no roof.
Or because there was a strong community of druids nearby who had a keen interest in football. I don't quite know, Jonathan.
The famous Lausanne druidic community.
But in the 86th minute, Hoberg scored again to equalise for Uruguay, which was incredible comeback, of course. Rounds the goalkeeper, slots home.
It actually takes it really well because there's two Hungarian defenders going back, and he sort of maintains his composure and waits and picks his spot.
Yeah, considering the pressure of that moment, as you're absolutely right, composure is the word. Now, am I right in saying, Martin, he then suffers during the celebrations a cardiac arrest?
That is right. Well, it appears that way. I mean, the post-goal celebrations, that produced that episode, in the Uruguayan press, they reported that he had collapsed and as a result of a challenge from two Hungarian players as he took the shot. But if you look at the actual goal, then you see that there's no players near him.
Well, and he also celebrates for a few moments as well.
And he celebrates as well, So he gets swamped by his players, and then he does appear to collapse, and he was taken off the field. He had that agonizing equalizer seems to cause him that cardiac arrest. So you see the famous picture. It's crazy, So you see that picture of him on the sidelines, footage of him as well, with the Uruguayan doctor. And someone else that have a towel on their head as well, something on their head. Someone thought it was
what seemed to be the thing to do in this game, according to the crowd.
Yeah. Well, that explains that. But anyways, there's a famous picture of him getting, his shirt's off, he's getting his chest massaged, receiving all kinds of smelling salts, whatever they did, and like that, he's back up alive and gets back on the pitch. But whether
and
that
then hits the post very soon afterwards.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, he very nearly completed a hat-trick to win it, which...
well, it would have changed the course of history, of course. But, I mean, Jonathan, sorry, Martin, yeah.
No, it's okay. So whether that was actually true or not, if he did suffer that cardiac arrest, I think the moment really, that really kind of symbolized the significance of that moment for Uruguay in terms of the game, but Uruguayan football as a whole. So, like, they were on the brink of being defeated for the first ever time. They were losing their spot at the top of the world, really. So the Uruguayans, well, in this case, it was an adopted Uruguayan. He was Argentine. He literally left everything on the pitch when he scored. It's just amazing.
And of course, the odd voiceover on the BBC highlights, as you said, Jonathan, was sort of it's all too much excitement for one
too
player.
much for Herberg.
I mean, it is remarkable, but of course, again, it shows you the sign of the times, not only with that voiceover, but the fact is that this man has suffered some sort of trauma and, a chest massage and smelling salts, and he's back on the field. There were no substitutes, of course, and off he went into extra time.
He hits the post, and of course, as the ball comes back off the post, Schiaffino and Grosic, the keeper, collide, and that, in as far as you can tell anything from these bizarre highlights, it seems to me that Schiaffino never quite recovers from that, but he's sort of carrying an injury as well. So your two main sort of forwards, one of them's had some heart problem, and one of them's just got clattered in the leg by Grosic. Yeah. And after that, Hungary do, as they would, they do seem to take control.
Yeah, well, and it's that man, Kocic, who finishes the top scorer, of course, with 11 goals, as I mentioned. And you said he was, the golden head, that was his nickname. And he scores 2 headers in the second half of extra time.
Yeah, and it does make you wonder as well that the fact that 3 of the goals are headers and the first goal is a knockdown, had Varela been there, would Uruguay have been better in the air at the back? But
maybe. I mean, I don't know. So even without Varela, Uruguay was still known to be strong in the air. So they had Maspoli, who was a big man, and they had their centre backs, Williams, Martinez, and Jose Santamaria.
And Santamaria, of course, goes on to play for Real Madrid and win the European Cup. So people may have heard of him as well. So yeah.
So at the time, he was in Nacional, and I think a few years later he moved to Real Madrid. But yeah, so that came as a shock to the Uruguayans as well, that they could concede 3 goals, in one game like that. But back to before the second half as well, before the extra time, there was another chance. It happened before Uruguay's equaliser, but in the Uruguayan, the legend is that after Uruguay had equalised, in the last minute of regulation time, Schiaffino had a shot that had beaten the keeper, and it was rolling towards goal, and it actually got stuck in the mud just before the line, and it was cleared by a Hungarian player. If you look at the reports in the Uruguayan press, this actually occurred when they were 1 goal down as well. But that's something that's kind of stuck in Uruguay. It's like, we got the equaliser, we almost won it right at the death. But that's how, if that was the actual case, we never know.
Well, after the game, Sebes, the Hungarian manager, thought that they'd won due to their superior fitness levels, which was helped by conserving energy by knocking the ball around better. And he said, both teams were excellent. I instructed the team to put the ball on the ground and make it run all the time. We were aware that Uruguay could not keep up the pace they were dictating in the final period of the game, and our assumption turned out to be true in extra time. Well, as you say, Jonathan, maybe not the best tactician, and maybe, well, almost certainly, those 2 injuries that you described, minutes earlier, had the real effect, and actually Sebes's idea of them having superior fitness.
Yeah, I don't know about that. It's something that I've never quite been able to pin down, because if you read a lot of the English newspaper reports before the 6-3 and before the 7-1, before the 7-1 particularly, English journalists are invited in to watch Hungary train, and they're shocked by how much physical work they do. And there's all these very precise details in the English papers of how they do these runs through the forest, how they do these shuttle runs, how they do sprints, how they do weights. So I think Hungary were unusually physically well prepared. Having said that, quarter-final against Brazil, 2-0 up, and end up clinging on really at the end, and had it not been for the sendings off, maybe they wouldn't have done. This game, 2-0 up, goes back to 2-2. Then the final, 2-0 up, and they lose it 3-2. So that quick start and then trying to cling on does seem to be the way they did it. So I haven't quite been able to work out whether they really were fitter or whether they were just capable of these very fast starts.
Yeah, well, some teams didn't take the warm-up seriously, and they were one of the few, as were Brazil at the time, which seems absolutely remarkable these days. But Hungary won, of course. Uruguay were knocked out. They were magnanimous in defeat, saying Hungary were the best team they'd come up against and so on. But what result what was the sort of ramifications, or I suppose, one of a better word, the sort of legacy of this result, Martin? Where did Uruguayan football kind of go from here? Was there a lot of inward looking, a lot of questions being asked?
Yeah, so I mean, the immediate reactions to the game were firstly positive. The Uruguayan press were in awe of what they had witnessed. Like they had said at the time, this was the game of the century as well. That's what they were saying. So they praised Uruguay for their honourable defeat, and also they really made the point of talking about Uruguay losing like champions. So they continued to play attacking, with attacking intent and with elegance. But also one of the headlines was, we know how to lose. And that was something that the Uruguayans kind of held on to. And I mean, when you're looking at it now, that might not be the case with some Uruguayan teams, some people would say. But they had a lot of praise for...
Was that also a comment, maybe a thinly veiled dig towards, say, Argentina and Brazil? We know how to lose?
It could be, yeah. I mean, maybe, but as I said, there wasn't, at that point, there wasn't a huge kind of, rivalry with Brazil. I mean, obviously they had one at Maracanã, but Uruguay was still kind of humble in victory as well. And maybe they just didn't know how to react. I mean, this is the first time they've lost on the global stage. But when Uruguay returned home, that's when the recriminations kind of really began. So the excuses come up about, firstly, Miguez's exclusion and its effect on Uruguay's attacking structure, and also Maspoli, Uruguay's goalkeeper as well. Some Uruguayan journalists were really, really critical at him as well. And they also look back to Uruguay's lack of physical preparation and also their tiredness and the injuries as well. So when you go back to that second half, there was another injury that we didn't talk about, who was Rodriguez Andrade, who was Uruguay's right back. So he had been injured. He injured his knee in the England game in the quarterfinal. And so you can see it in the footage that his right knee was strapped up for the whole game. And he had actually suffered that injury. It had worsened in the second half of that extra time. And the Uruguayans like to say that, when he was off the pitch, that's when Hungary were able to push ahead and get those equalizers. But anyway, so overall, I think, so the game signaled the beginning of the end for Uruguay's global domination and the end of that kind of Maracanã generation. So Odulio Varela, he never played for Uruguay again, and he would retire altogether from football the following year. Schafino went off to Europe, so before that World Cup, he had already had a transfer to Milan agreed to. So he went on to even represent Italy with Alcides Gija. So this first defeat kind of, it was the realization that the kind of rest of the world really had caught up to them and surpassed them, I think. But looking at it now, it's more of for Uruguay, it's seen as a missed opportunity, a real, what could have been. Decades later, some of the Uruguayan players, so looking at the 70s, there's a few interviews that I've read with Varela and also Andrade, or Rodriguez Andrade, who pretty much just said, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about that tournament at all. So it really represented, it was really a missed opportunity for them. But looking back on it now, it really represented a kind of lost time as well. It was like a game that was played respectfully, without much violence. Uruguayans were losing honorably. So Uruguay's current coach, Oscar Tabares, he's actually spoken about the game a couple of times, I think during the World Cup and even before the friendly against Hungary at the end of 2019. And I think it was in primary school at the time. He said that he listened to the game on the radio, but he used to talk about, or he still talks about, how this current Uruguay side is seeking to kind of bring back that spirit of 1954. Really idealistic, respectful, a game based on mutual respect between opponents, playing hard but playing fair, and that, bar a few kind of famous exceptions. Uruguay, the current Uruguay team's kind of lived up to that. But anyway, it's all very idealistic. But remember, so this is Uruguay. It's been a long time since they've won a World Cup, so the so-called correct way to play, it usually takes a back seat, especially for a country where winning is the only option.
Yeah. Well, Martin, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this game, one of the great games, of course, from World Cup history. I'll leave the final words to the Welsh referee Benjamin Griffiths, who said post-match, "It was a battle of real men, a tough contest with some excellent football." Bravo, here. So there we are. For more stories like that, go check out theblizzard.co.uk. But Martin, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
No, please. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely right. Pleasure was all ours. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, as I say, check out theblizzard.co.uk. It's goodbye from myself and Jonathan, and we'll see you next week.